I remember I was sitting in my best friend's car as we drove around my hometown of Calgary, Alberta, when I checked my email and saw a message that would change my life. Not to be dramatic or anything. This was October of 2021, and the email was from Shannon Lyon of Ravensburger asking me if I wanted to submit a pitch for a board game that seemed made for me. A cooperative, immersive, expandable game that featured Disney characters. Now, I've always loved Disney movies and going to the parks as a kid and as an adult. But when I was trying to remember what joy felt like in the depths of the COVID pandemic in 2020, I stumbled across Disneyland vlogs, and it sparked an even bigger love for all things Disney. So to be asked to come up with a game based on beloved Disney characters felt like a perfect and exciting opportunity for me. I will forever be grateful to Shannon for inviting me to submit a concept for this game. But how did I even get this email in the first place? We have to go back to February of 2020 for how this all started. This was when I attended the New York Toy Fair for the first time because my party game Act Fast was debuting there and I wanted to be there for that. This was the first time one of my games was on display at a convention, so it was a really big deal for me as a board game designer. I also took this opportunity to pitch to publishers who were also attending the event. And I did one of the most uncomfortable things you can do, especially as an introvert, go up to booths and introduce myself and ask if anyone would like to hear a pitch. Thankfully, everyone was incredibly kind and friendly, even when rejecting pitch after pitch. But one of the publishers I really wanted to introduce myself to was Ravensburger. Now, I grew up playing Ravensburger's amazing Labyrinth and also admired the success they had with their villainous board games. So I tried to discreetly peruse their booth until I saw my opportunity to ask if someone was available to hear a pitch. Now, this was towards the end of the festival, and so they could have very easily said they didn't have the time or capacity to hear a pitch. But thankfully, Steve Warner of Ravensburger made time to hear my pitch. And I will forever be grateful to Steve for making time to meet with me. I showed him a tile game I had been working on for a while called Where the Wind Blows, and it ultimately was a no, but I got Steve's contact information and we stayed in touch. I then started to get emails from Ravensburger asking me to submit concepts for new game ideas. Over the course of the next year, I would submit 6 game ideas to Ravensburger, all of which got rejected. Even just a few weeks before getting that email about the Disney game, I had received a rejection email from Ravensburger. This is all to say that I had to repeatedly put myself out there and get through quite a few rejections in order to get to the point where I received that email asking for submissions for a new cooperative Disney game. One of the biggest strengths a designer can have is forgetting rejections quickly and hoping the next one will work out. If I had let those rejections cast doubt on my abilities as a designer and not even want to submit an idea for the Disney game, then I wouldn't be here sharing this design diary with you today. On that day in October of 2021, my mind started going a mile a minute, thinking about all the different directions I could go for a cooperative Disney game. I tried to focus on the specific aspects the game had to have according to Ravensburger. It had to be cooperative, so teamwork is key. Immersive, so the players should feel like the characters they're playing. Accessible, can be played in 45 minutes and ages 8 and up. And scalable and expandable. So it should be able to be played at 2, 3, and 4 players, and expansions should be easily integrated into the base game. So Ravensburger said the game had to play up to 4 players. And the characters that had to be included were Maid Marian from Robin Hood, Elsa from Frozen, and Moana from Moana. The 4th character was up to the designers submitting their ideas. Now, Elsa would eventually change to Violet from The Incredibles, but my first prototype included Elsa, which you'll see later in the video. The 4th character that I chose to include in my pitch was Belle from Beauty and the Beast. I always loved how her main attributes were her curiosity and love for books. I felt like those qualities would be fun to work with in a cooperative adventure game. So I had my 4 characters. Now what? I want to frame this design diary with the challenges that I faced and then the different approaches I took to face those challenges. Sometimes us designers can just start changing things or just throwing things out there without thinking about what problems those changes are trying to solve. So I want to frame this design diary in the same way, by breaking up each section into what the challenge was that I was facing and how I tried to solve it. Challenge number 1. Brainstorm concept for pitch. The first major challenge was coming up with my overall concept for the game. Now, Ravensburger did not want a thoroughly playtested final game. They wanted to hear initial concepts and would then work with the designer to develop the game. So I had to come up with a strong initial concept. I really tried to focus on 2 keywords from the brief provided by Ravensburger: immersion and teamwork. For immersion, I wanted to have a really good handle on all of the characters in the game, and so the first thing that I did was rewatch all of their movies. I paid special attention to the qualities the characters embodied and any quotes that could be used for flavor text and help give direction for the tone of the character. I also thought about games where I felt completely immersed when I played them, like Dungeons & Dragons and also classic adventure video games, like Riven, Leisure Suit Larry, and the Monkey Island series. In these games, exploration is a central factor, and I wanted to have that same feel in my game. This approach helps set the overall tone for my pitch, an immersive game based on exploration and completing quests. I also really wanted players to feel like the character they were playing. This led to me wanting each character to have their own quests, unique abilities, and custom dice that they would use in their quests, but also combat. I imagine each character having their own adventure pack filled with all of their pieces. Ravensburger specified that the game should take place in a neutral land, not in any lands associated with the characters specifically. So I sketched out a board with locations that I felt could be incorporated into many different quests. A castle, a village, an inn, a jail, and spaces for location tiles that would change depending on which characters and quests were being used that game. This would increase the replayability factor, which was always in the back of my mind. I then sketched out player boards that showed each character's special ability and how they would engage in combat. For example, I wanted to focus on Belle's love for books, and so I gave her 3 books she could read that would help her with healing, combat, and movement. I then brainstormed some quests for the characters with a focus on immersion. Here you can see Maid Marian's quest to save Robin Hood from Prisoner's Tower, where she needs to find rope that she can attach to her arrow and then shoot through the window and Robin could slide down. The quest involved Maid Marian choosing between stealing rope or buying rope and then doing target practice, where she would roll dice onto the back of the card that had a target on it, before then attempting to shoot the arrow through the window. As you can probably guess, this was way too much text and too many steps for a game that should be playable by kids ages 8 and up. This issue of simplifying the game and reducing overall text would be a recurring theme for me over the development of this game. So I sketched out each character's custom dice, action tokens, quest locations, and quest items, and was enjoying the direction I was heading. Now moving to the concept of teamwork, which was my other focus besides immersion. I kept rolling the words collaboration and cooperation around in my head, and the idea of having shared action cubes came to me. Rather than each player taking a certain number of turns like most other cooperative games, I had the idea of having a supply of action cubes. And the group would decide which actions they would take each round. They could decide to sail a Moana's boat for an action, or Maid Marian could deliver a gift to the castle, which would increase the maximum number of actions per round. So in this way, there wouldn't be any turns. The group would just decide which actions they would take each round. By not having turns, communication and collaboration are necessary. When players have a set turn, you can get into a situation where each player simply takes their actions without any input from others, and then play just moves to the next player. Now, I was aware of the issue of quarterbacking, which is an inherent problem in cooperative games. Quarterbacking refers to one player taking over the game and dictating what other players should do on their turn. So I did some research into the topic and remember something that designer Gil Hova once said, that sometimes all players need is something tangible to hold up and say, hey, it's my turn, I make the decision. So this gave me the idea of having the leader badge. A badge that the leader for the round can hold up and say, wait a minute, I'm the leader and I think we should do this. The leader badge would then rotate to the next player the following round. It's amazing how effective it can be to simply have a physical thing that players can hold up to show it's their turn to make the final decision. Now, I also wanted to emphasize teamwork in quests. While each player had their own individual quest, other players could help with their friends' quests, and in many cases, it is much easier or even necessary to rely on other players to help complete quests before time runs out. Which brings me to another major consideration for my pitch: what is the end game? For my initial concept, I said the players had to each complete their individual quests before the end of 7 rounds to win, and they would lose if they ran out of time or if they all reached 0 health. This more or less stayed the same throughout the development process, but I will speak more about the evolution of the end game later on. So I playtested my initial concept with my sister Liz and her husband Rob. After the playtest, I felt confident enough to create my pitch video and cross my fingers. And now here, for your viewing pleasure, is my pitch video. Enjoy. Hi there, my name is Pam Walls, and today I'm going to show you my concept for the Disney Heroines cooperative game. My overall concept is an adventure game for 2 to 4 players who must each complete their individual quests before the end of 7 rounds in order to win. Teamwork is at the core of the game, as the players will have a limited number of actions, and rather than each take a turn one at a time, the group must decide how they will divide up their actions amongst themselves each round. And the characters will often need to rely on their friends to help them succeed in their missions. For example, Moana will need a friend to keep watch of her boat while she dives deep down into the ocean to retrieve a fishing trap, and Maid Marian will have a better chance of successfully shooting an arrow into the top window of a tower to rescue Robin Hood, the more she does target practice with other heroines. Elsa's ability to create ice bridges is so powerful that she could injure herself, but if needed, a friend could take that wound instead. The 4th heroine that I have added to the group is Belle, and she has a collection of books that she can read to become an expert on different topics, and her friends will rely on her knowledge to heal, to fight, and so on. The game consists of a main board with some locations that are permanent, including the main castle, a village, a jail, and the inn where the characters always start their adventures. There are 4 other spaces on the board that always change each game, making each experience new and different. These spaces are for the location tiles associated with each character's quest for that game. In this example, Elsa needs to ice over a volcano before it destroys the town of Elgerhart. Belle must retrieve an ancient book from a group of bandits hiding in a cave in the ancient forest. Moana needs to retrieve fishing traps so the people of Kunoa don't starve. And Maid Marian must save Robin Hood from the prisoner's tower. Each character has their own player card, which shows their health level, their rules for combat, and their unique ability. Elsa can build ice bridges, which can make movement around the board much easier. Maid Marian can use her royal connections to bring gifts to the queen at the castle and earn her team more actions per round. Moana has a boat, which uses fewer actions to move around the water. And Belle has her collection of book tokens, which can be activated for different powers. Each heroine will also have their own deck of quests unique to them, and items and location tiles for those quests. As players move around the board, they will trigger different events, which will present a choice, and the outcome of the player's decision could be good for the group, or bad for the group, or somewhere in between. For example, Moana may come across a sea creature, and must choose if she wants to fight it or befriend it. If she chooses to fight it and loses 3 or more health before defeating it, the creature will grow stronger and angrier, and movement on the water will now cost 2 actions instead of 1. If she chooses to befriend it, she will have to stay there and play with the creature until the other players have taken 4 actions. Then she could say goodbye to her new friend, but before she leaves, the creature shows her a secret underwater portal that the group can now jump between. If the group of heroines are able to complete all of their quests before the end of 7 rounds, they win. And that is my pitch for the Disney Heroines game. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. This is a dream project for me and has been a ton of fun to work on, and hopefully we can continue to work on this project together. Thank you. So a few days after I sent my pitch video to Ravensburger, they got back to me asking for me to mail them a prototype, which is always a good sign. I was very excited, but I still kept my expectations low. I packed up the prototype, mailed it off to them, and then waited. The Ravensburger team said they enjoyed playing my game and liked the direction I was headed. So they scheduled a phone call with me to tell me that they chose my concept to move forward with. I remember I was a delivery driver at the time, and so I pulled over to a side street to take the call, and I was just so excited and buzzing for the rest of my shift. Now it was time to really get to work. Challenge number 2, make games scalable, expandable, and replayable. I first focused on the design challenge of building a system that would make the game scalable, so able to be played at 1, 2, 3, or 4 players, expandable, seamlessly add future expansion characters to the base game, and replayable. Let's start with making the game scalable. Very early on in the design process, I had the idea of creating adventure packs for each character that would include all of their components, so that players could simply grab the characters' packs that they wanted to play that game and use those components to set up. These packs originally included quest location tokens that would be added to a static game board. While the map of the board would never change, the quest tiles would, depending on which characters were playing. I decided that the static game board didn't offer enough variation and replayability, and it also created awkward situations where if there were 3 players and 4 quest locations, one of them would have to add 2 quest location tiles so that there weren't any empty quest location spaces. So instead, I decided to create a grid of small land and sea tiles that were shuffled and laid out to create a different map each game. This was definitely heading in the right direction, but the high variability and randomness of the layout of the tiles created situations that could make things very difficult for certain players. Like if many of the water tiles were surrounded by land tiles, that would render Moana's special boat ability quite ineffective. Or if one character's quest location was completely isolated from everything else. So I found a happy medium between a static board and a grid of small tiles by creating larger landscape tiles that included several locations on each and had exits on each side so they could be easily connected with each other. Each character would then have 2 of these landscape tiles that made sense for their character. So more water on the landscape tiles for Moana and more land on the tiles for Belle, for example. In this way, the landscape would look different depending on which characters were playing. This also made the game more scalable because it would naturally create a larger or smaller map depending on the number of players. This system of self-contained adventure packs also meant that the game could be expandable, since expansion characters could be easily swapped in and out and then just setting up the game based on which characters are being played. It also meant that there would be very few repeat components found in the base game and any expansions. To further increase replayability, I increased the quests per player to 4 for a total of 16 quests. This meant players could play a significant number of games with brand new quests each time. Challenge number 3, reduce complexity and fiddliness and increase fun. Reducing the overall complexity and fiddliness, meaning number of steps or in-game maintenance, was the main feedback Shannon would reinforce with me. It truly helped streamline the game and kept the target market in mind: casual adult gamers and families with kids aged 8 and up. The main areas that required streamlining were actions, player abilities, combat, and quests. For actions, I originally had quite a few things cost actions or energy, as I called it for a while. This included healing, fighting, and moving, as well as specific actions related to quests. This meant that players would have to refer to the rules or the quest cards to see what did and didn't cost an action. Over time, and thanks to Shannon's feedback, the things that cost actions would only be movement, healing, and special player abilities represented by action tokens on the player boards. This greatly reduced the player's mental load to remember what costs an action. For player abilities, in my original pitch and for several iterations after, each player's abilities acted in completely different ways. Over many playtests and discussions with Shannon, we decided to standardize how players activate their abilities, and for each player to have the same number of ability tokens. This would eventually turn into each player having 2 move or heal tokens, 2 base abilities, and 1 special locked ability that would become available once that character completed their quest. Each player's abilities would be unique to them, but the way they activate it by placing the ability token on the action board would be the same. For combat, in my original concept, the enemies had their own dice, which would be rolled in response to the hero's attack. The number of times the dice would be rolled corresponded to the strength of the enemy, with stronger enemies rolling more than weaker ones. There were also wound tokens that would be placed on the villain to represent their damage, and once their damage reached their strength level, they would be defeated. The heroes also had unique dice or tokens and engaged in combat in entirely different ways. For example, Belle would flip her Combat 101 book during combat rather than rolling dice. If it landed on the book side, she would inflict damage on the enemy. And then Maid Marian had arrow dice and would roll a number of them equal to her health. The heroes could also face multiple villains at a time and would have to declare which villain they were attacking before rolling their dice. Now, all of these things, while fun in theory, resulted in slow, drawn-out battles and greatly increased the component count with all of the enemy dice and wound tokens. Shannon had the awesome idea of combining the hero's attack and enemy response into the same dice. Now when the heroes attack and roll their dice, they could inflict damage on the enemy, but also roll damage against themselves at the same time. This increased the pacing of combat and reduced the overall number of dice needed in the game. And I ultimately decided that all players should roll dice in combat, rather than some players flipping tokens like Belle with her books, since everyone agrees rolling dice is fun. And when I played as Belle, while I loved the idea of activating my book token, I felt left out of the fun of rolling dice during combat. It was also through a lot of playtesting that we landed on the distribution of hits and damage on the dice that felt most balanced. We also decided that giving players one reroll during combat seemed to work best. And we also made the decision that the enemy would always recharge to full strength at the end of a failed battle, so there was no need for wound tokens anymore. It was also clear that heroes should only ever face one enemy at a time, so there was never the issue of having to declare which enemy they were attacking, which slowed things down and created some confusion, like could leftover damage from one defeated enemy be transferred to the other remaining enemy. To resolve this, I added numbers to the different locations that corresponded with numbers on the villain tokens, so that you would always place that villain at that location and you would never have more than one villain at a location. And land villains would only appear on land, and water villains would only appear on water, like Gaston at the village and Ursula at Deep Cove. However, the numbers added visual clutter to the landscape tiles and villain tokens. And since the enemies were eventually changed to essences of villains, they could appear on land or water without any issue. So we moved to the idea of a vortex spawning villains on unoccupied spaces. It's a simple solution to ensure that there's only ever one villain per space. I also played around with the idea of gaining something when you defeated a villain. Now, I went down quite a few paths for this, including having the enemies drop different items that the heroes could pick up, or energy that could be used to move or heal. I also explored the idea of the defeated villains turning into light that could then be spent to buy different powerful items that the group could use, like portals that could transport the group from one location to another on the board. Again, a lot of these ideas were fun in theory, but they added a layer of complexity to a game where there's already a lot going on. It was quite difficult to let go of the idea of the enemies leaving loot behind after their defeat, but it was ultimately the right decision. Now the enemies do turn into light when they are defeated, but the light is not then used for any other purpose after that, except in some quests. And instead, the players start the game with fun abilities rather than having to buy special items during the game. And then they each have one special super ability that is unlocked once each player completes their quest. Now for quests, coming up with 16 unique and interesting quests that didn't add too many more components with fairly restrictive text limits was quite challenging. My original quest had quite a bit of story and narrative because I felt they were a primary way of immersing the players in the game. They also had quite a few steps because I wanted them to feel like epic quests with a lot of twists and turns. The text limit that I had to work within made me really focus on the most fun parts of the quests and cut everything else. This was for the best since players, and in particular casual gamers, would feel overwhelmed looking at a wall of text with multiple steps on their quest cards. I greatly reduced the narrative, reduced the number of steps, and used icons instead of words whenever applicable. Challenge number 4, building tension towards a climactic endgame. My original endgame was simply once all players completed their quests. This led to a fairly unsatisfactory ending for a few reasons. Players who had already completed their quests didn't have much to do while they waited for their friends to complete their quests. Not everyone was involved in the final actions needed to win the game. If players weren't paying attention, they might not even realize the game had ended, and it doesn't tie into a story. This led to me wanting to create a build-up towards a climactic and thematic endgame. One very simple path I tried was simply requiring all of the heroes to gather at the castle after they all completed their quests before the end of a certain number of rounds. This was heading in the right direction, but still didn't result in any high five moments. Another path I explored quite extensively was that of a supervillain unleashing enemies in the land. The heroes would then have to defeat the supervillain at the end of the game to win, like the final boss in a video game. We played around with the supervillain increasing in strength as the rounds went on, but most games ended in the same couple of rounds, so this didn't create much tension. The supervillain's strength would be so high that more than one player would be needed to defeat them. This eventually led to the requirement of all heroes having to gather for the final battle, which really helped everyone feel involved right until the end of the game and reinforced the idea of teamwork. Eventually, the supervillain was replaced by a vortex that spawns villains in the land, and the players being required to gather together to close the vortex as a team at the end of the game. Throughout my playtesting process, I had played around with how and when to add villains to the board. I originally had them being added from quests and event cards, but adding villains at the start of each round solved the issue of wanting to increase the pressure on the players throughout the game. So we had the Vortex spawn villains at the start of each round, and wanted some uncertainty about how many would be added each time. We played around with flipping tokens that would range from add 0 villains to add 5 villains. But we found that to be too swingy, so we reduced it to either 1 or 2 villains being added each round. These would eventually turn into the darkness cards, which would also be the timer for the game, which show how many rounds the players have left. Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to this somewhat lengthy designer diary for Chronicles of Light, Darkness Falls. This game went through so many different iterations, but the core always stayed the same. An immersive adventure game that reinforces teamwork by not having turns and instead deciding as a group what actions to take as they defeat villains and embark on quests. I am so very grateful for this opportunity, and I want to thank Shannon Lyon for sending me that call for submissions email and them working alongside me to bring the best out in this game. I also want to thank the many playtesters who helped shape the game, especially my mom Nancy and dad Darcy, as well as Liz, Rob, Meg, Lau, Pat, Michelle, Deb, Anna, Lorna, Tammy, and everyone at Vancouver Playtest Group. I spent many hours working on this game, but there is one moment that really stands out. It was during a playtest with a family with 3 young daughters, and after the game, when asked what they thought of it, the youngest said, "This isn't like a regular game, it's an adventure." And that truly was the highlight of the entire process for me. Anything beyond that will be the cherry on top. Now, I hope this game helps you and your friends and family create memories together as you embark on your own adventures. Thanks for watching.